A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. You are welcome to today's fourth town hall meeting. My name is Evelyn Naikoba. I am your host for today's discussion, and joining me virtually is a host of three well-constituted panelists, politicians, that will be discussing and expounding on our theme for today, COVID-19 and the political response. What are the lessons, the benefits, the costs, and implications? I will introduce them and share a bit about them, and then we can get into our discussion. Firstly, we have Honorable Winnie Kiza on call with us. We have Simon Senyonga on call with us, and Emily Burns will be joining us shortly. Honorable Winnie Kiza is a politician. Many of you know her. I will read her profile briefly, and then we can get into our discussion. So she's a prominent political figure and democracy advocate who has served recently as, or most recently as, Uganda's first female leader of the opposition between 2016 and 2018. She's a member of the country's main opposition parties. She served in the Forum for Democracy and Democratic Change, and the Alliance currently is part of the Alliance for National Transformation. She has represented Kasese District since 2006. As the chairperson of the Parliamentary Committee for Government Assurances and the Parliamentary Committee on Local Government, she has worked closely with civil society organizations under the Black Monday movement to fight corruption in the country. She's currently a member of the Alliance for National Transformation political party. We also have Simon Senyonga joining us for this very pivotal discussion. Many people call him controversial for most of the statements that he makes, but he's a human rights and constitutional law lawyer. He's also a face that is rising within the political spaces. He has made various appearances on our political shows within the nation and without, and we'll be discussing in detail our theme for the day. I also want to welcome our online audience. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of today's discussion. I encourage you to like, to comment, to share this video with your contacts and on your various social media platforms. Kindly invite as many contacts as you possibly can. It's high time that we took active participation in the affairs of our nation, the things that affect us, the things that mold the state of affairs within Uganda. Kindly comment as the conversation progresses. We'll have people pick up on your comments and questions and address them to the different panelists as the conversation goes on. I will introduce Emily Burns as and when she joins us. And so, without further ado, we'll get into our discussion. Again, our theme for today is COVID-19 and the political response. What are the lessons, the costs, the implications, and the benefits thus far? Have our politicians represented us ably in managing the COVID-19 crisis, as it has been called for the most part? As we get into our discussion, I'm made to understand that public health underpins a lot of political or the policy framework and diplomacy as well. Public health encompasses promotion and the safety of health environments, and this includes policy making as well. The big question before us today is whether our political leaders have taken into consideration the health of the populace while drafting these policy frameworks. We have been made to understand, or we've come to believe, that COVID-19 has affected economies, has affected livelihoods, has affected various sectors within and without Uganda. Uganda is not the only country that has been affected by the COVID-19, and our politicians have taken center stage since March 2020 to deal with this situation at hand. So would like to know whether our politicians have ably handled the situation. And this is not just for the panelists, this is also for us that are joining in would like to know, would like to hear your views. Are you satisfied with the political space? Are you satisfied with how our politicians are dealing with the situation at hand and the aftermath, most importantly? I'm sure we know that with time, COVID-19 is going to fizzle out. But we need to take cognizance of the effects that have been created by COVID-19 and consider how well positioned we are to advance going forward. I will start our discussion with Honorable Winnie Kiza. I'd like to know if Honorable Winnie Kiza is hearing me. Honorable Winnie Kiza?
Yes, I hear you.
All right. Thank you, Honorable, for joining us.
I hear you very well. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We're very pleased to have you. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this pivotal discussion. You are a very famous figure, a very famous face within the political spaces. And today we're turning our guns to you, not to shoot you, but to engage with you on how well you think our Ugandan politicians are handling the situation, really, are handling the COVID-19 management. My first question to you would be based on what we have observed around the world. As COVID-19 started, or when it started, we had a lot of opposition parties that were relatively in support of the lockdown restrictions that had been implemented, the lockdown measures, or the public health control measures for that matter. As it progressed, or as it evolved, we've observed that not many of them are actually comfortable. They realize that civil rights have been curtailed, the lockdown measures might be a bit too stringent than they would have been. We've had that frustration culminate into protests all over the world. We've seen in countries like France, in Germany, in Poland, in Spain, protests all over the streets following the citizenry request or demand that lockdown restrictions are lifted, a state of emergency is removed, vaccine mandates are not mandatorily imposed. We've had opposition parties actually taking center stage in this fight. In Germany, the opposition political party has taken center stage in demanding that lockdown restrictions are lifted altogether. In countries like Austria, we've had, I think it's the Freedom Party that has taken a keen stand on emphasizing that, or informing the government that they're overstretching their limits in the whole COVID-19 management process. Now, when we come to our dear Uganda, do you think that our political parties are doing enough? Do you think that our politicians are doing enough to cater to the public interests of the people? Because public health really envisages the populace, the well-being of the populace. So in a bid to combat the spread of the coronavirus, in a bid to deal with the aftermath of the coronavirus, are our politicians really engaging meaningfully in catering to the interests of the public, in enacting policies that are favorable to the Ugandan, the average Ugandan? Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn, and of course my brother Senyonga for this conversation. I still pray that where I am operating from in the part of the world, the network is not bad. I'll just request our participants to allow me that some bits of the conversation I will be muted. You will only hear the voice, but you may not see the face. Coming back to your question, Evelyn, the problem that we have had as Africa, and specifically as Uganda, is that politicians would want to use every opportunity to market themselves, use every opportunity for corruption, use every opportunity to make themselves grow richer and richer at the expense of the masses. Everybody is so sad that we were hit by this coronavirus pandemic, and our sincere sympathies and condolences to the families who have lost dear ones to the scourge. But I also want to be quick to say that this pandemic is following other catastrophes that have befallen our countries. Talk about HIV. Many people may not know that malaria kills even more people than corona in Africa, and specifically in Uganda. And therefore, we need to take much attention and have a lot of emphasis put on equipping our health sector, ensuring that our health workers are fully facilitated and are well prepared to handle disasters as and when they come. Now, going back to the lockdowns and, of course, the occurrence of the coronavirus pandemic, the very first 14 days of the lockdown, Ugandans welcomed them with total support to the president, and we want to thank him for having told so. At the time the first lockdown was pronounced or declared, Uganda had not faced any victim of corona. We had zero case, we had 0 death. So in our own way, we thought the country was preparing for any eventuality in terms of stocking the health facilities, in terms of preparing the health workers, in terms of possibly recruiting the necessary staff, and engaging in finding ways through which we can handle this catastrophe as a country. And all Ugandans said, yes, Your Excellency, I think you are doing the right thing. But as time went on, we realized that the lockdown was used for now political reasons. Many people were forced out of businesses. Political actors were curtailed from participating in politics under the pretext of observance of the coronavirus guidelines. Yes, we know that it was very necessary for people to follow the guidelines, but where now the regime lost it, or the politicians lost it, is where now focus was mainly on the opposition political actors. To the extent that when government officials and politicians would gather, we saw this during the primaries of the NRM. Nobody was tear-gassed, nobody was harassed, but then subsequently we saw that whenever members of the opposition would gather, the corona red card would be flagged all over and say, you know, you are spreading COVID, we are arresting you in regard to violation of the COVID regulations. And then we came to realize that I think it is not really about ensuring that the population of Uganda does not get COVID, but that there are some sounds or voices that needed to be heard alone without the alternative voice. So that is where they lost it. Otherwise, at the beginning, everybody thought the country was meaning well. We thought our politicians were doing it for the good of the population. It was even made worse when they said, yes, we are contributing food, taking it to the people whom we think are so much heat. And we saw the type of food that was being distributed, the way it was being distributed, how we failed to get accountability for all the money that was contributed by well-wishers. And then we said, I think we would rather leave the country unlocked and let people fend for themselves than sitting down to become beggars. people handled HIV, and I think as a country we are dealing with it. And I said, I think now it is something different than the COVID virus prevalence in the country. So that is how, in my own view, I feel that the issue was mismanaged, the issue was over-politicized. We saw now violation of human rights. We saw now how it took another turn, how people were being beaten, how people were being harassed, and then we saw that this is now beyond COVID. It's just political. They are using a cover of COVID to harass Ugandans, to intimidate them, to violate all the human rights that are accorded in the many rules and protocols with impunity. So I can say that as for now, the politics has messed up everything. To the extent that even the vaccinations that are being talked about, people are worried whether they should take them or not.
So I can say briefly that our countries are not doing enough. At the beginning, we thought it was for the good of the population, but along the way they missed it and went into now making money out of the misery of the sick, out of the misery of the population, and out of the misinformation that surrounded the whole thing, and ensuring that it is used for purposes of clapping on the opposition when it came to the time of an election. I can tell you that even at the beginning of it, members of the opposition said, for the sake of our population, for the sake of saving our country, we can even agree that elections be postponed a little, so that we keep the population safe, so that we don't encourage any interaction and any closeness, because we knew the excitement that comes with campaigns. Government said no. Later, we only came to realize that they were going to use it as a window of locking up the members of the opposition so that government becomes the only single player in the elective process. And I think COVID, in a way, was used to clap on democracy and make democracy lose meaning. So after that, anybody who was talking about COVID was not being seen as being done in good faith. And up to now, I can tell you that the population has given up on government. They don't think they are doing whatever they are doing in good faith. So Evelyn and colleagues, let me leave it at that for now, and possibly we can further engage.
All right. Thank you very much, Honorable Winnie. You mentioned that the population seems to have given up because the government doesn't seem to be taking into interest the well-being of the Ugandan. My next question following that would be, we've come to understand that a lot of what has been implemented in Uganda with regard to the COVID-19 management is based off advice from the scientists. You know, in the different speeches made by the head of state, we often hear him allude to scientists' advice. Scientists have advised that, you know, the lockdown should be extended. Scientists have advised that schools should remain closed. Scientists have advised that places of worship should remain closed. Scientists have advised that occupancy caps, you know, should be placed, for example, on places of worship. Interestingly, there's a former CDC director named Tom Friedman, if I remember correctly, who asserted that the guidelines that are given by Center for Disease Control and Prevention are not directives, they're merely guidelines, and it's up to state health departments and local health departments to take up that advice or not. However, what we see in Uganda is that a lot of the recommendations that have been made by CDC or World Health Organization have been taken up in the absence of best data to inform those decisions or to inform that direction, so to say. My question to you would be for you to share your opinion on whether you think there's been enough probing on the scientific advice that informs a lot of the policy framework or directives that Uganda has taken, especially from the politicians as well. Because at the end of the day, for Ugandan or for the Ugandan populace to give up is unfortunate, but also we entrust our power or authority to our politicians, the elected officials that sit in the different governmental offices. My question is, are they probing enough, especially to represent the Ugandan citizenry? Because obviously for them not, for the Ugandans not to have trust means they're dissatisfied with some of the things that are going on, they're dissatisfied with some of the policies that are being enacted, they're dissatisfied with some of the decisions that are being taken from top government offices. However, we have a voice, or so we believe. Our politicians, our elected officials, our MPs, have they probed enough?
Thank you, Evelyn. I think, just like you have said, Ugandans still needed to engage in this conversation.
Okay.
They believe that a lot is happening without their input. They believe that even their representatives have somehow betrayed them. But even the representatives themselves, I can tell you, at least by the time when we started discussing the issue of COVID, I had not taken leave of Parliament. I was still in Parliament. I still remember the questions coming up from the members of Parliament. We are not informed. We are not being briefed. How do we guide the population? At what level should we engage the population? Those scientists were briefing a small group that the president had set up. At some point, we would hear it is scientists' opinion. But another point, then the president will tell you these scientists have also not studied enough of these things. I'll just use my own guidance as the head of state. And you know, we know him as Rutahavurwa. So as someone who tells you that for him he is Rutahavurwa, how do you expect him to get any guidance from anyone? You rightly put it that there are other countries that demonstrated. Germany, we saw, yes, Norway, we saw even some pockets of people in the US protesting the lockdowns. I think even to us in Uganda, we would even have protested more. The scientists are guiding. But when you go downtown in Chikubo, as churches are closing, as schools are closed, but you go to Chikubo, the situation is the same as it was before COVID. So really, do you think the people who are coming to Chikubo are vaccinated or they are COVID-free? It is the same question that I asked. As you say, political gatherings are not welcome, but the population sees members of a ruling government political party gathering and in big numbers, hugging and dancing, and you, the head of state, preside over such a function, and you are stopping other people to congregate. Do you think they will take you seriously? So we came to realize that the guidelines as being read and as being assumed to have been provided by the scientists were just cosmetic. And two, they only served to curtail a certain population. By the way, members of the private schools in Uganda are saying, I think government just wants to deal with us. You can see how suspicious the whole thing has become. That I think government just wants to get the private school owners out of business so that it is only the government schools that are in business. Private schools which had taken loans are going to close because banks are going to take up these institutions, if not compel them to sell forcefully. And when they compel them to sell forcefully, definitely they will not run again after the period they have spent with the loans from banks. Now, you come to a population of members of parliament or legislators who are equally disempowered. They are coming from a population that is disempowered. So do you expect such a population to give the correct view of what is happening? Those of you who are following the issues in Uganda, there arose an issue where the members of parliament said, also give us part of the COVID money so we can go and consult our population. The issue now merged from legislation to looting. I'll call it looting. The members of parliament started saying, we are also being faced with these problems of members of the community who are saying we should feed them. In a sense, a country like Uganda that does not have a robust social security program, just closing the economy like that, you are killing people. You can imagine the individuals who have lost jobs. And there is no way government is going to tell me it's going to possibly take it up to ensure that Ugandans don't fall victims of the lost opportunities, the lost jobs. While in other countries, Norway, Germany, even when there are people are saying, for us, we want a break. For them, they want to go clubbing. For them, they want to go maybe swimming and go to resorts and go have fun. But to us, we are looking at the bare minimum. I want to go and work. I want to go to the market so that I can get food for my children, so that possibly I can get what I can survive on for the next day. We are still basing on survival. So locking up an economy like that one, that is still barely surviving without any social security mechanisms, without any protections given to the population, and you are leaving other members of the same community with impunity to interact as much as they can, people don't take you seriously. And like I told you from the beginning, for us, we thought the first lockdown was to give capacity to our government. And we all told our populations, I remember leading the parliamentarians from Kasese on radio talk shows to tell our population, please adhere to the COVID regulations, social distance, wash your hands, use masks, use sanitizers. Let us first prepare as a country. We basically thought the first time we were going to have a lockdown, and it was meant for preparing ourselves as a country so that we can meet this monster with readiness and preparedness. Little did we know that we were inviting disaster and trouble, that we are going to call the nation to violation of all forms of human rights, that we are going to use COVID to suppress dissent, that we are going to use COVID to keep our children illiterate. UNICEF gave statistics of the children who have become pregnant, the girls. 90,000 girls have become pregnant due to COVID. I mean, the keeping out of school. 15 million learners are at home. We don't know whether all of them will come back to class when eventually they open in January as it is suspected. And the condition has been, if we are to open, you must all have been vaccinated. So we are not so sure. And we are depending on borrowed vaccines and donations. As a country, we have not put any mechanism of ensuring that we do our own procurement. If we are to do any procurement, it might be minimal because we are depending on donors to give us vaccines. So how are you going to manage a country? How will you manage a country? You are telling them vaccinate, but you are borrowing the vaccines. So as a country, I can see there is a big gap between the legislature that is supposed to make the rules and regulations and possibly the scientists together with the population. There is a very big disconnect. And like you put it, Evelyn, guidelines are guidelines. They are not supposed to be mandatory. And therefore, when maybe while World Health Organization says, we encourage that you keep social distance, that you clean your hands, some of these things should be the norm, that we should keep safe. And yes, we must all keep safe. But when you use the situation that is so complex in terms of health and safety to disadvantage a certain population of the community, it becomes unfortunate and is so sad. That is why we feel that even possibly the lockdowns that are being imposed on the country are not necessary, and therefore.
All right. Thank you very much, Honorable Winnie. Emily Burns just joined us. I will introduce her, and she'll be a second panelist that I'll engage with. Allow me to read her bio so that I don't miss out anything. Emily Burns is a politician who belongs to the Republican Party of the USA. She's a congressional candidate for the 4th Congressional District of Massachusetts. She is also the founder and CEO of Learnival, which is one of the biggest marketplaces for private instructors in the US, with more than 25,000 private instructors in all 50 states and across more than 100 disciplines. She also has a background in biochemistry from Sweet Bear College, USA, where she participated in neuroscience fellowships at Northwestern University and University of Minnesota. She also has an educational background in music and philosophy after having undertaken courses in Russia and Israel. Emily is an author at Brownstone Institute and a contributor to the Brownstone Institute. Emily, we're very delighted to have you. Emily, are you there?
Unmute. Yes. Can you hear me now?
We can.
I apologize.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I was just saying that I was simply blown away listening to Winnie, and I was I think that if people here could hear that, I think that is the thing that is what you just described. I think is what we fear would happen here, and the fact that you were living it is it's really terrifying.
All right. Emily, I have a couple of questions to you. We'll start off from a very controversial standpoint. CDC is meant to be America's first line of defense against disease. However, over the past couple of months, 18 months, it has been plunged in a lot of scandal, a lot of controversy surrounding the various guidelines that it has issued, from their initial diagnostic kits to their ever-changing mask mandates to their vaccine mandates. And as somebody that has authored quite extensively on various topics, you know, addressing the myths on child to adult transmission, on the functionality or otherwise of lockdown mandates, whether masks really work, I'd like for you to share with us your opinion on these different aspects for the benefit of our viewers that might not have had a chance to access your writings just yet. What is your take on the various public health control measures that have been imposed in the USA but also across the world? We see that up until now, so many states have their places of worship closed. For those that are partially reopened, they're faced with, you know, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, occupancy caps. From your perspective, is it really necessary, or do they work? Are they effective, so to say?
So I think one of the things that Winnie mentioned that was really important was the idea of the public having a say in public health. And I think that's probably the thing that has been lost most completely. The CDC provides guidelines, but in order for any public health to operate from any position of authority, it needs the mandate of our support and our respect, and they don't have that, at least not here. And I don't think it sounds like they do there either. And the reason is exactly what you guys have been describing. It's this hypocrisy where you've got one group that's able to live their lives however how they want, and many other groups that are not. What you've described is significantly more restrictive than what we have. And so as far as the CDC goes, I think people need to remember scientists are fallible too. They're humans, and they're subject to all of the same failings that any one of us are, and therefore they need to be subject to all of the same requirements that the rest of us are, and expectations. You don't trust me implicitly. I don't trust you implicitly. I certainly, I welcome criticism. You welcome criticism, because otherwise we have no way of, there's no way of holding people to account. And I think as far as the CDC goes, what we're really seeing is something that's become very much a political tool, where science, which is my original field of study, it's been weaponized, and it's being used as a shield to protect the politicians, whereas it should be a tool that we can use to help, but that's not what's happening at all. To me, it's really the opposite. And I think that the way that you make science work as a tool in this capacity is you inform people, and you tell them what you know, you tell them what you don't know, and then you let them make their own decisions, because as humans, we are animals, right? One thing that animals do really well is try and survive. I mean, it's like our gut thing. It's like, we all want to live, so give us the information. We're going to do our best to live, and we'll weigh all of the different things that come to bear. I mean, I'm reading on the chat about starvation being an issue in your country, and you describe this, and people, I mean, to put a virus that is so selective in whom it attacks, in attacking the very old, the very sick, and apply the same. It makes no sense, because you guys, you are a young population, and that is, it hardly makes sense. People need to be grappling with, we need to be given the choices to take all of these risks ourselves and do the best that we can. And I think in a place where there's, I mean, it doesn't work here, like, these lockdowns. To me, the lockdowns were, and you can see this throughout in the data, and that I frequently say the lockdowns were protect the rich, infect the poor. And you see this very well in the data here in Massachusetts. It's a completely linear relationship in terms of number of infections versus level of education. And that really is, and what you described is, it's again, what you described is, it's bad here. It's not that, the level of hypocrisy is not quite that high, but it's, and you said the kids aren't going to school. Again, this is like, if we all looked at the entirety of our, if we looked at the entirety of these measures, we would each be able to weigh them and say, okay, is it more important for my child to go to school versus to run the risk with this disease? Is it more, should I maybe be going outside and exercising instead of hiding inside, because then that will help me with my health? That's where I come down on kind of the CDC. I think it would do far better to take the input of individuals, or not to take the input, actually to provide guidance and allow that guidance to be an input for individuals to make their own best decisions. That's how I think science works. That's how I think government works best in terms of empowering people. I don't think it works. I don't think mandates work at all. I think they're very, very counterproductive, and they always end up being used as, I think they do end up being used as political tools. I didn't answer, you asked a lot of questions there about like how I feel about all the other stuff. I think we'll probably get there, but that's my general thought on the CDC.
My next question would be on the very response to the COVID-19 management in the USA. Across the USA, we've seen different states respond differently. Currently, we have quite a number of states that have lifted, the restrictions, the mandatory mandates or mandatory restrictions, so to say. We've seen states like Florida, we've seen states like Texas, we've seen states like Maryland, New Hampshire, pretty much defy the COVID-19 restrictions with their governors, asserting that their people need to get back to business. They realize that those mandates are actually affecting the business and the livelihood of the people. We have other states that have decided to move from them being mandatory directives to guidelines, meaning they could or could not be followed by the public. And then we have others, like DC, that insist that, COVID-19 is serious, lockdowns are serious, and everything must remain closed, so to say. So as somebody that, one, is running for office, but two, I'm made to understand that Massachusetts still has lifted some of the restrictions, but then I guess it does have vaccine mandates. So judging from your vantage point and as a politician running for office, what would you say ought to inform policymakers, in enacting policies that are suitable for the populace, that should help remove, unfair restrictions that are instead affecting their people, so to say?
Yeah, and I think the US is a really interesting case study because you do have these 50 different states and the policies relatively well documented. And so you can actually use that to provide analysis that is fairly powerful about the level of efficacy of the lockdowns, of the mask mandates, of all that. And that's one of the things that I've done a lot the last year is look at that. And you can see that there's really no impact in the overall health outcomes with these mandates. They do not help. There is no statistical significance. And I think, so given the fact that there is not a strong signal that says that these things are really effective, there's a bunch of, frankly, not very good science suggesting that talks about that says that masks work, but we don't see it in the empirical data. We don't see it in the randomized clinical trials on masks. So I think when you have data that's that weak, you have to allow people, or again, not at all, you have to let people make their own decisions because, again, I do think people make better decisions for themselves. We just have more information about what's impacting us, what matters to us, as opposed to if we rely on, if we tell people. So I think I do still live, Massachusetts remains, it's not the strictest state. California, I think, California and Oregon are significantly stricter. But we see that in our unemployment rate is still almost double what it was before the pandemic. We had one of the lowest employment rates in the country. Now we have more than, almost double what it was. We see, we have a very high level of vaccination, upwards of 70% in this state. And again, I think the vaccines are very helpful for people who are at risk. I think they're a wonderful tool for that. But when you look at the data in terms of how they actually impact disease spread, vaccination rate does not tie to lower levels of spread. So it really means that you need to be focusing on getting the people who are at risk vaccinated. And that makes sense. That makes perfect sense to me. But shutting down your entire, you guys are shut down to the point where you're not sending kids to school. You're not sending, it's bizarre. And what we see here in Massachusetts is we see the people who remain masked are the people who are subject to the most control. So it's kids remain masked in school, and service workers. Those are the people who remain masked. And the wealthy don't have to go to work masked. Yeah, people work from home, and they just, so that we're really creating this two-tier society that where the mask is a very clear signal of who is subjugated, who is like who is under somebody else's control. And I look at it and I think it is, again, the data shows, like, for instance, the CDC made a comment that vaccinations were the key to getting economies back. But actually we see in the US, we see the exact opposite result. The highest rates of vaccination are tied to, they have those 10 states have significantly higher unemployment than the states with the lowest vaccination. And that's not because vaccinations cause unemployment, right? It's because this safetyism and this belief that we can control things actually ends up causing harm. It shuts down the economy. It makes people not be able to make their own choices. And these are, this is something where, again, they're not acting from a position of, they're really not, they say they follow the science, but they're not following the data. So I think it's hard to say you follow the science if you don't follow the data, and the data is quite clear.
All right, thank you, Emily. With specific reference to what you mentioned about the different mandates and their functionality or otherwise, I take special interest in places of worship. In Uganda, places of worship have suffered quite a bit of stringent conditions, and their reopening is pretty much linked to following the science that dictates that masks must remain worn at all times, the science that dictates that vaccination must be effected, the science that dictates that social distancing must be in place. From your assessment of the treatment of places of worship in the USA, have they received fair treatment, and what can be done to advance the prompt reopening of places of worship?
I mean, unquestionably, they haven't been. And I will say I was particularly impressed with it in the early days, the pushback that we saw from different places of worship. And I think we see that still, like in Canada, which remains pretty crazy right now. Like we see a lot of people where there are some examples of very brave pastors who are defying these dictates, which again, when you dig into it, they're just not having an impact. And so I think, gosh, it's hard to say how, because you're clearly coming under a fairly arbitrary and capricious government that chooses to close places of worship, but not other places. And that was certainly the case, where at here when our churches were closed, it was, you could go to Home Depot and go things like this, but you couldn't go to church. And I understand where they came from originally. They came from the idea of, like, you have lots of people packed in together, right? We can all understand that that's a higher risk environment. But at this point, so again, I think that seems to be one where we would say, this is a higher risk environment. If you're a higher risk person, maybe you should stay home from church or watch it on Zoom during your season, whenever your COVID season might be. I don't know when Uganda's is, but every place has a different COVID season. We now see, and but allow individuals to make that decision, and it's not for some people. Again, some people who are at risk may choose to go because that may be that important to their lives. And you think about, in many cases, you think about the really extreme elderly whom we've basically kept locked up for the last year and a half. Many of those people have only 1 to 2 years to live. So how is that quality of life? But I would recommend, as a way of, from a policy perspective, as a way of kind of easing restrictions, I would say that people ought to simply recommend that people who are higher risk be aware of those risks, and that's their choice whether or not they absorb that risk. Because the reality is we're all of our governments, or even though they won't say it, they're all operating under this COVID-0 thing, which is not possible. And so like to keep people out of churches is purely based on a stop the spread thing. But like you said, I mean, other people are going out in other places, and it doesn't stop. Like this is not going away. The vaccines are non-sterilizing, meaning they do not prevent infection. They do reduce serious disease. It's not going away. So if it's not going away, are we going to keep religious institutions closed forever? I mean, that seems to be that's a natural, the logical conclusion to so many of these things. Like if you don't do this, you're going to have these bizarre restrictions in place forever. I can tell you, I met a friend the other day. She's a doctor, and she came to book club at my house, and she wore a mask the whole time, or book club at my friend's house. And I asked her, because she's double vaccinated, and she's she's probably got a booster even though she's 40. And she said, well, I'm wearing it for my patients. And I said, well, okay, we won't even talk about the efficacy, but I said, like, when does that stop? Because there are no more vaccines coming down the line. This is how we are, right? All of your patients are vaccinated. You're vaccinated. It doesn't get any better than this. So if we choose to continue, at this point, it makes. So I think, for your question on the churches, I am not 100% certain how. I don't know how you push. You guys are doing what you can, which is pushing back against, frankly, tyranny, and that's. But I don't think that there's I don't think that there's a reasonable medical stance from that at this point.
All right, thank you very much, Emily. We'll get back to you. Now over to Simon Senyonga. Simon, I will ask you a very direct question. What is the role of the church and places of worship in matters of policy, in economic matters within our country, or worldwide, so to say? Because the church exists all over the world. Does it have a place in policy development, policy implementation? What is its role?
All right, and I mean that's a very interesting question, because the whole relevance of quote unquote a democracy is to include everyone in the fundamental discussion of what should be able to guide a nation in making decisions. So we find ourselves at a time where we have we are living in most nations are living in a medical tyranny, where the public, I love what Emily said and what Winnie said, that we're living in a time of a medical tyranny where the scientists want to control the dominant narrative of the day. So they're influencing the governments through the big pharma, through the big tech. There is massive censorship of information. So what happens right now is that people are seeking for alternative information that restores hope to them. So the media has been largely controlled by the dominant narrative, which comes from the scientists and from the politicians who are parroting one scientific narrative. So the alternative place of discussion should be, number one, the places of worship, number two, the civil society spaces. So the places of worship, from the very first instance, are the national consciousness of the nation. They are the ones who are supposed to be that voice of hope, that voice of faith, that voice of guidance to the nations. But right now what is happening is that spaces are being curtailed. I don't know how it is in Massachusetts, Emil will tell us, but what is happening in Uganda right now is that there is a serious whip that is being cracked on the civil society spaces in Uganda. We are in a time whereby I think the largest funder of the civil society organizations, DGF, has had its works curtailed, with the government having overreaching policies and tendencies over it. And in Uganda, we have an experience, and I know it has happened all over the world. I like what, I was watching, I think it was Donald Trump's appearance. For the first time, an American president appearing before and convening a United Nations meeting just to push for the freedom of worship and the freedom of religion within the globe. And he made a very interesting comment about how there is a systematic plan of regimes to curtail the freedom of worship, because they know that the freedom of worship does not only come alone. The freedom of worship comes with various elements. It comes with the element of the freedom of assembly, because people are able to gather. It comes with the freedom of expression, because people are able to voice out their concerns. There are other complementary, rights which come with it. For example, the right to employment for those who are employed by places of worship, and the right to life for those who seek to come for restoration. So what is happening right now is that the church, so to say, or the places of worship generally, have to be the voice advocating for the fundamental human rights of the nationals. One of the things that has been ignored, and why we're having this debate and this discussion right now, is that my freedom of worship is highly tied to my freedom of life, or my right to life. Because my right to life means that the courts of law internationally, and even in Uganda, have interpreted the right to life not only to mean breathing in and breathing out, but everything that makes me to have a dignified life. Now, when the CDC, when the global governments, when big tech, when big pharma come in to say that I cannot live a dignified life, number one, by forcing me to look like a zombie with mask mandates. Number two, by forcing me to receive a compulsory vaccination, all right, they're taking away my dignity systematically. Then thirdly, they're telling me that I cannot attend a place of worship, meaning that I cannot gather, all right, and for African setting, for example, and I know all over the world, that, let me just use Emily's words here, that we are a human race, and a human race that deserves to be together. We have social elements to ourselves, and the places of worship are the basis, are the major basis. Places of worship, family, cultural institutions and traditional institutions are the major basis of creating this social fabric. Now, when you say that you're keeping me out of the place of worship, what that means is that I cannot fundamentally enjoy what gives me dignity. And that is why we are saying that the various COVID restrictions being imposed on the church have to be resisted by all means, by the places of worship. So even just to summarize, this is what I would say, that the role of the church right now in pushing for policy discussion, number one, should be in resisting any medical tyrannical tendencies that want to impose vax mandates, that want to impose mask mandates, that want to impose, in other nations internationally, vaccine passports. I've seen what the Canadian pastors have been doing. And I think the Justice Center for Constitutional Rights from Canada has been doing massive work in protecting those fundamental rights. Secondly, it is the role of the church to actually create platforms of discussion where people can have alternative discussion, because we all know that mainstream media is receiving and parroting one dominant narrative, which is coming from the scientists. So beyond resisting, creating alternative platforms, I think also engaging and aggressively lobbying the policymakers to make sure that they consider consciously the mind of what God perceives for these nations. In Uganda, for example, our motto is "For God and my country." Now, what that presupposes is that we ought to be mindful of the place of the church, the place of places of worship in this nation. So, as a nation, we ought to seek the divine supreme power of God through Christ to guide the nation in everything that we do. And I think this is the pace that I appreciate some of the leaders that have stood out. I like what Donald Trump was doing in the USA before the Democrats destabilized him. We have classical examples in Africa. Tanzania took a firm stand and said, look here, we are going to believe God as opposed to this. Now, they put themselves on the line and there was fruit to this. they accessed the middle income status before Uganda actually did. And it's attributed majorly to the mind of the leader who was in that place. In Zambia, down here below just Uganda, in the African continent, His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema also made a stand and said that, for example, we are not going to consider the dominant narrative of places of worship being super spreaders without any scientific background. And he kept them open, and we are seeing them rising up aggressively. Now, I know other nations which have in the Scandinavian nations which have fully reopened, and I think we have also seen sober Christian leaders within the USA. I think specifically from Florida, from Texas, people have been quite sober, to take away all these curtailing restrictions. And I like the example, for example, from Massachusetts, where Emily, you're from. I know that there is a specific exemption to the gatherings of the places of worship where they are not putting preconditions. When you look at some of the other states, they are saying that some of the states in the USA, they are saying that yes, you can gather, all right, but with following strictly the CDC public health guidelines. But for Massachusetts, they are saying that they are considering places of worship as essential places. And because they are essential places, there ought not to be any limitations to the gathering. And I think these are very good examples that the state of Uganda can take.
All right. Thank you very much, Simon. You talk about medical tyranny. You talk about advocating for the church and other places of worship to resist these forceful restrictions that are being imposed on them. Well, however, what I find interesting, and I'm sure you're aware of it, places of worship seem to have been turned into vaccination centers here in Uganda, following the most recent, announced by the president probably in October, beginning of October. Places of worship were directed or were advised, so to say, to conduct vaccination programs at those premises, as well as work in tandem with the government to implement the different government programs relating to the COVID-19. So my question to you, is there more to eat than meets the eye?
I think let me just answer that question briefly, just in two parts. Number one, we have to appreciate the historical perspective of Uganda to appreciate where we are going. And then secondly, we have to take comparative examples of what has been happening in other states. I'll begin with the second leg of my argument. Canadian pastor Toby Antisen, I think he must be from Manitoba, declared to the judge that, who he faced after he was arrested for violating COVID restrictions, and said that the state cannot dictate to the pastors what narrative they are going to speak on the pulpits. And he was saying that the judge had a crooked mind because he thought that the state dictates the kind of gospel, so to say, that has to be on the pulpits. Now, I want to think that at the time where we are right now, what dignity requires of us as a nation and for the leaders of this nation is that they need to take some of these outstanding examples of people who, in my perception, have taken the right path and course in terms of defending what they stand for. Because you see, you don't only possess human rights for the sake of speaking about them. You possess fundamental human rights because you know that you should be able to take a stand to defend them. Now, that's what we ought to be doing. So, beyond what meets the eye is that, number one, we are having many people who have been persuaded that these rights are simply given to them by the state. So they simply think that the state gives them the rights. I think on all the platforms that have appeared, I made this stand very clear. The government does not give me my human rights. The government, my human rights are inherent. They're not given to me. And the interesting thing about that principle is that it cuts across all the nations. Across all the constitutions of all the different nations. The principle of inherency means that your rights come from God. They come from a supreme being. So whether or not somebody is a believer, there's a recognition that there is a power that hands over these rights. What the governments do is to protect these rights, not actually, they don't give them to me, they protect them. So the call here is that, number one, we should be able to realize that our rights are inherent. My freedom of worship is inherent, not given to me by the state. Therefore, I must be able at all points to defend it. With everything that I have, with my knowledge, with my power, with everything, my wisdom that I can use. Now, that's the comparative example that we should be able to pick. I mean, in some of the states, the good thing we have Emily on the call here in Massachusetts, I don't think anybody has died because they have attended a place of worship. The thing is that what has happened in some of the African states and all over the world, I've seen it in Australia, I've seen it in France, in Italy, Norway, where I think in some of these states where there are now massive strikes against vaccine passports. The concept of the super spreaders is something which, you know, is not scientifically proven in particular areas. So what we are having right now, I like what Honorable Winnie said, that at the beginning of the lockdowns, the governments tried to persuade us to think that they were doing this because it was noble. And because it was noble, they had to close down temporarily. What began as 15 days went in 2 months. What went from months has gone in 2 years, into 2 years. And even they're anticipating that we can go on for a longer time. So in taking comparative context, we must look at those who have stood fundamentally for their rights. But secondly, for those who have said, no, we must question the dominant narrative. Now I'll come to the second leg of my argument, which is that we must look at the historical perspective. Now, Uganda has had a history of actually the government strategically persecuting the places of worship. And I'll prove this with just this simple evidence. In 2018, a law was designed in Uganda called the Religious and Faith-Based Organizations Policy. That law was beginning to take root in Parliament. By now, a leader who has joined the opposition. That gentleman is Honorable Nambeshe. I think he must be from somewhere in Mbale. He was pushing for the Religious and Faith Organizations Bill in Parliament. The idea of that bill and the idea of that policy was that the government wanted the places of worship to parrot government programs. Now, to make it relevant for Emily, who may not be in Uganda right now, this is what it meant. That if government came and said, let's say in the USA, government comes and says that right now it's about, yesterday I saw the Vice President of the USA, Kamala Harris, taking a booster, her third jab, and saying that, right now, you know, I have a third booster, so please everyone should take this booster. What that would mean in the Ugandan context is that the government would now begin using government programs to replace the gospel in the places of worship. Now, that was something that we had to resist from way back. Now, COVID-19 has offered a convenient platform to the government to reintroduce some of the elements of that specific bill and that specific policy. One of them was using places of worship pulpits to parrot government narrative. Secondly, was to dictate levels of education to pastors and preachers. What are we seeing right now in the COVID situation? Governments are dictating to community leaders, they are dictating to pastors to have a minimum level of qualification in health studies before they can stand on pulpits to guide people. So what they want is that a pastor must have a specific scientific qualification. So beyond what meets the eye right now is that COVID-19 is being used as a platform for the government to push ministers of the gospel, to push religious leaders to attain minimum scientific qualifications. Now, what that does is that government ends up overstretching its hand into what place of worship have to do. Now, that means that government can begin issuing permits. That if you're not able to get a permit, a scientific permit for you to preach to the congregation, the government can take away your rights. But you see who is going to accept that? So what the government wants to do is that it wants to give us licenses. And that's what COVID is doing. And I really hope that at all the different fronts, I'm calling upon my colleague Honorable Winnie and Emily from, everybody who is watching us right now, that you need to resist this. What the government is doing right now is that it wants to introduce, with what you're seeing as vaccine passports, I will not be shocked if they introduce scientific licenses to places of worship before you can preach. But I'll just conclude with this. Again, beyond what meets the eye is that you have to look at the specific restrictions which were put on places of worship before they opened. In Uganda, we were told, we were given 4 preconditions before we could open places of worship. Number one, that we, as places of worship, we had to mobilize and popularize government program on vaccination. Number two, we were asked that we had to put a limitation to the people who have to gather. We were given a tyrannical number of 200 people before we can gather. No scientific background to inform 200 people. Number 3, we were told that we have to put on masks and, sanitize and all this kind of thing. Number 4, which is very absurd and very, very dangerous, children and elderly people are not allowed to attend places of worship. If they can do that for places of worship, that means that soon at political rallies they will not allow children, elderly people, or anybody they perceive as contradictory to dominant narrative to attend these places of gathering. So beyond what meets the eye is that COVID-19 has propagated and presented a platform where the government can control, curtail, and destroy the freedom of worship in this nation, but also all over the world, because Uganda is learning from various nations. You can see what is happening in the United Kingdom, and that is where Uganda is always learning from. In some states of the USA, from the World Health Organization, from Dr. Fauci and all his colleagues who are propagating for the lockdowns.
All right. Thank you very much, Simon. You speak very passionately on this issue, okay? But at the same time, we have been told that churches and other places of worship are super spreaders. I'm sure you know that, So when you talk about government overreach, isn't it justified for places of worship to experience or to be given such restrictive conditions, as you call them?
I think, just very quickly, number 1, the restrictions that have been given to places of worship are disproportionate. You see, you cannot say a church is a super spreader or a place of worship is a super spreader, but like what Honorable Winnie said, that when you go to a marketplace, all right, the same children and elderly people who are refusing to attend a place of worship are the ones who are going to the marketplaces which are congested. Number 2, about the disproportionate aspect, is that you don't give us scientific numbers to prove the concept of super spreaders. So super spreaders is a concept that is in the mind of the political leaders, not scientifically proven under any study. All right. Number 3, if you're talking about applying of these restrictions, we have a supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. Now, my legal background tells me that under Article 43 of the Constitution, when you talk about restricting fundamental human rights or limiting them, the Constitution says that number 1, it must be according to the public health, all right? And yes, okay, we have said there could be public health need, but even that has particular aspects to it. Number 2, it must be done under where it is acceptable and demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic state. Meaning that you must analyze, is Uganda a free and democratic state? If that is the basis, then that takes superiority. Then we must do something that is acceptable. Now that means that if you're going to pass any law, it must be a law which is lawful. All right, like Martin Luther King said that humanity has an obligation to defy laws which are unlawful. So this law that you're going to pass must be lawful. It must recognize, actually, it must recognize the fundamental human rights. Now, you can't put a limitation which destroys a right. What is happening right now in Uganda is that they have put a limitation to my right of worship, my freedom of worship, and they're destroying the right as opposed to limiting it temporarily. So it is not justified in any way. I don't know whether, Emily, in Massachusetts, you have any studies. I was looking at your studies on rational ground, the articles that you've written. I haven't seen any scientific study that tells us that places of worship are super spreaders, where it has been proven scientifically. I don't know whether Honorable Winnie in Kasese or in any part of the country and the world where you've moved, there's been any scientific study to actually demonstrate that places of worship are super spreaders. So the whole thing is just, it's just total baloney. It is just total rubbish which the state wants to propagate to confuse the nationals, but above all, to destroy their fundamental rights.
All right. Thank you, Simon. Simon, you mentioned that you'd not be surprised if permits or licenses, scientific licenses, are introduced for religious leaders before they can gather or before they can stand before a congregation. However, what we find interesting currently, and this is to you, Honorable Winnie Chiza, in Parliament, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament recently made a remark or informing the legislators that effective tomorrow, which is 2nd November, members of parliament are not going to be allowed to access the premises at parliament or attend house sittings if they are not vaccinated. So in effect, their job is at stake if they do not get vaccinated. They are going to have to carry vaccination certificates. What is your comment on that? We can't hear you, Honorable.
I'm saying the speaker missed a point.
Okay.
At the onset of COVID, Parliament had to change the rules of procedure to provide for virtual representation to the extent that someone can sit in the comfort of his home or his office and legislate. So to even say you are putting a ban for members of parliament not to come to the house because they don't have these certificates, you are just not being in tandem with your own rules that you preside over as a speaker. Secondly, I don't think that members of parliament are the category that is under any danger. You know, that is the problem that we have had. Instead of going to the communities of the elderly, and you know the president was making his submission the other day, and he said the Bazukulu should go and carry their grandmothers and grandfathers. He missed to understand that there are some elderly who are taking care of themselves and they don't have even those who can carry them to the nearest areas for vaccination. But to me, I think it was a misplaced argument. It was a misplaced directive to the extent that people who have not been consulted, you have not given them an opportunity to go and consult their people on how their public health should be dealt with. And then you tell them, don't even come to represent your people. It is so absurd. And that is what I've told you, that they are using COVID in many ways to propagate what they want to propagate. And I can tell you that maybe without a lot of time, they will even start saying, you honorable so-and-so, we realize that even when you are carrying a card, your card is forged. They are the ones who are controlling the systems. They will tell them your card is forged and therefore you are not allowed in parliament because they know what they are going to talk about. They closed bars, but there are some bars which are functioning and near police stations. They close churches, but I can tell you that some areas are even more super spreaders, like Castle Simon was saying, than the churches themselves. I think the devil is in control. The devil has taken up the states. And as leaders, Christian leaders, we need to take up the mantle and defend our country. Uganda's motto is for God and my country. And I would really feel that the Speaker of the House would be the last person to infringe on the rights of representation that the members of parliament carry. Because by blocking a member of parliament out of the House, you are summarily closing out the people that that member represents. So it is unfortunate that this kind of curtailment that is being put on churches, that is being put on our population, is even going to those who are supposed to be defending the rights of human beings. So I think the Speaker erred both in law and in human, but also in morality. The vaccines that we have are not enough to service the entire population of Uganda. So why do we say that the leaders should start first? The good leader must be an example. Serve others first before you serve yourself. That is why the leaders that we have think about themselves in terms of allocating the resources to themselves before they allocate the resources to the people that they represent. So it is unfortunate that even leaders are forced to take vaccines, that the people who would serve the population first are now being told to serve themselves first before we even agree on whether we are on consensus that it should be mandatory or not. So Castle Simon ably and precisely presented everything, the situation as it is in Uganda and Kasese in particular. And I really want to say our country is dead.
All right.
The ones we think are fighting for us are not fighting for us. Humanity is being corrupted. Humanity has lost the moral fabric of how a society should be. And I would pray that we go by our motto, "O Uganda, may God uphold thee." For
All
God
right.
and my country.
Thank you very much. The conversation continues. COVID and the political response. What are the lessons, the benefits, the costs, and implications? As we continue to engage with our panelists, kindly allow me to read the different comments that are coming in. I think each one of you that is actively participating in this discussion, this is anonymous. From the look of things, there's just a group of people that are actually church haters who are behind all the COVID restrictions and guidelines. Moses King says, human rights are inherent. They are not from the government. The government just protects it. The state cannot dictate to the church what the ministers have to share. Susan says, my rights come from God. What the government does is to protect those rights. Simon says, my freedom of worship doesn't come from the government. All right, we have quite a number of people that are quite passionate about places of worship, churches being reopened here. I see somebody else mention, Diana asked the question, can the government first make sure all the children of Uganda can access internet before they can infringe on my right to worship? Lisa says governments are supposed to run to the church, not the other way around. Clara says there's no clear evidence on what settings are super spreaders. Chikubo is congested and we have no stats from this setting. Okay, over to you, Emily. Simon, in his discussion, mentioned something. In Uganda, children below the age of 12 are still banned from places of worship under the guise that they're quite fragile and therefore should stay home. As you might have heard from our discussants, schools remain closed in Uganda, despite several calls from global organizations, including UNESCO, to have schools reopened with the understanding that it's creating a lot of harm, more harm than good, and is affecting quite a number of children. I think their estimate is 117 million children that are suffering terribly from the closure of schools. So my question to you, based on Simon's presentation, what is your take on child to adult transmission? Is it a myth? Does it work? Should we be worried? Should children remain home? What is your take on that?
Let me just ask, just to better understand the situation there. Are they keeping children out to protect the children or to protect the adults from the children?
We'll have Simon respond to that.
I think what's happening in Uganda, it's neither that nor anything scientific. So what's happening is that the president wakes up one day and says that his senior epidemiologists have advised him that children and elderly people are some of the most vulnerable. Now, maybe to put context to this, this is a mandate that was dictated as of August 2020. It has not been amended nor improved in any way based on new scientific evidence. So we cannot affirm or disprove whether the state wants to protect the children or from the elderly or from the elderly from the children. So it's just a blanket measure that children and elderly people are not allowed to access places of worship.
It's stunning. So what we see here in the U.S. is that as far as the risk for children of getting COVID, and I'll address the other question, but I think that's important too. Or when children get COVID here, the risk of death is 2 to 3 times less that of their risk of death from flu. So it's extremely small. It's on the order of 0.001%, which again, so 1 in 100,000. And those children have, when research has been done on those, the children who have succumbed terribly to that have been extremely, extremely ill, which again, it's every child's death is a tragedy, but the question is whether or not what impact COVID had on that. And so that is, I think, keeping healthy children away from anything, particularly from schools and churches. I just keeping them out of society, that the damage I don't think you can overstate it. Here, I know the risk of suicide here for children is significantly larger than the risk of death from COVID. I'm sure, that there's so many things that are more deadly for children than COVID. I mean, swimming pools are more deadly for children than COVID. Any number of RSV, so many things are more deadly for children than COVID. As far as the spreading, they're from children to adults. The problem with contact tracing and those kinds of things is they're not great usually anyway, but there have been a couple of good studies done. There was one in Iceland that was done very early on that looked at the actual DNA looked at the virus, so that had done genetic sequencing, so they were able to really track it. And they found all of these ones, they weren't able to find one clear example of child to adult transmission. That said, I'm sure that there are children who pass COVID on to adults, but it's at a lower level. And that's what I've seen, you see this pattern repeated over and over again. It ends up being that, like, in any type of scenario, you'll see sort of a 4 to 1 difference. For instance, when we do things in schools and they've gone and tested all the schools, the people in the school, they'll see that it looks like the transmission is more where adults will transmit 4 times as much as children. And that's, again, that pattern has been repeated in a bunch of different studies. So it seems like it's close to accurate, hard to say. The other thing, though, that I think is really interesting is there is actually a mechanism for which children would be less likely to pass on COVID, which is they're significantly less likely to be symptomatic. They're 3 times less likely to be symptomatic as a 60-year-old. So I think it's funny because here, since children are some of the few people who aren't vaccinated, you have a lot of adults who are afraid of being around children, but they're less likely to be symptomatic, which means they're less likely to transmit, as far as we know. And so I think that, that's a reason why you wouldn't want to do that. But also, somebody I've seen in the chat where people have said, people aren't supposed to live like this, and that, of course, that's true. You don't undo what's thousands, or you don't undo what nature and God have done for the last millennia, and try and reorganize it, and particularly around societies, right? We evolve, our societies evolve in a way that makes sense, right? Like we kind of go off there's nothing wrong with going off your gut, and our gut is to be around people, and that is, that's probably a good hunch. But when it comes to kids and adults, you can see in many studies, actually, children provide a protective effect to adults, and I think that's because they are, they're always around them, right? So adults who are around children all the time, they have much stronger immune systems. And you guys were describing extremely crowded conditions. I'm sure that the adults in those scenarios have much stronger immune systems too than adults who are holed up in their houses. But I think when we're all together, we constantly inoculate each other to all sorts of different diseases, and that makes us healthy. I think that our trying to parse apart, to peel apart society and put it into different buckets is going to reduce that cross exposure that we all have. And again, with kids, if if you, let's say you had a child who has COVID, maybe it's a mild case, and maybe the amount that they spread is not significant, not very significant. There's a lot that we don't know, and I think that we could have learned had we not been so focused on doing other bad science. But I do think that when it comes to children, like children, just they are not at significant risk from COVID, period. There are any number of things that are so much higher risk, and they are far lower risk of spreading to an adult than another adult would be, even a vaccinated adult. So that to me, I can't see the reason for hiving them off from society. I mean, it just seems like the most, it's just wrong.
All right, thank you. Simon, I have a question for you from one of our online viewers, Diana Manja. Her question is, from the legal perspective, what should Ugandans do now that their political representatives are not helping?
I think, number one, the Ugandans need to realize that there is a constitution. We can debate about the enforcement of the constitution or its lack thereof, but the most important thing is that people need to assert their power when they're defending what belongs to them. Article 3 of the Constitution is very clear about what to do when leaders usurp our constitutional rights. And by the way, many Ugandans feel uncomfortable around this conversation, but it's because it sounds controversial, but that's what it is. The Constitution says that Ugandans have the power to overthrow anyone who attempts to overthrow the Constitution. That's Article 3 of the Constitution. It's very, very clear. Before we talk about how to defend their rights in the courts of law, I think in Uganda, what has happened today, and I want Ugandans to take interest in this, a group of human rights activists in Uganda took interest and filed suits in the courts of law, from the High Court to the Constitutional Court to the East African Court of Justice. Emily, that is the regional court of the East African part of the African continent. What the Ugandans have to do, if their parliamentarians are failing them, they should be able to mount public pressure onto the judiciary to ensure that there is fast ruling and hearing on these matters. Because there are people who have asserted their power through the courts of law. So it is legal for you to overthrow a regime under Article 3 of the Constitution. It's very legal as long as somebody attempts to usurp your powers. All right? Now, it is about how you choose to overthrow. What is not allowed is for you to take up military arms. That's another way of looking at it. But right now what you are doing is that people have gone to the courts of law. So can they mount pressure onto the judiciary? Number two, as Ugandans, we have a role to actually mount pressure on our political leaders. Every Ugandan out there who can hear me right now, you need to mount pressure on your parliamentarian to refuse to go to parliament if they're asking them for their vaccination cards. Because if we, the citizens who elected the leaders into parliament, are being oppressed with vaccine mandates, and then the parliamentarians are also being asked to present vaccine mandates, that means the only people who are still free right now is not even the judiciary. It's only the executive, which is being controlled by the globalists. So there needs to be a conscious assertion of power against the parliamentarians to resist stepping into the August House. That's how we can put an end to some of this tyranny. Second, and that is all legal. The other thing that the Ugandans have to do, they have a duty it must be under Article 7 or under Article 17. I just need to get it right. They have a duty as the citizens of these nations to civically participate in discussion which is supposed to take their nations ahead. So wherever the Ugandans are, they need to begin organizing, forming platforms. It is legal for you to form platforms of engagement so that we carry over this message to the different Ugandans out there to understand that their rights are being usurped, not just by their local leaders, but by globalists, by big pharma, by big tech, and all, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, which wants to control our country. So what we are seeing right now is that there is an extension of neocolonialism. COVID-19 has presented a platform for the extension of neocolonialism. And Emily, I was reading one of your pieces where you're talking about the impact of these COVID restrictions towards racial oppression. And right now what COVID is doing is that it's arising the deep-seated feelings of the nationals along racial lines. Because we know that some races are poorer and richer. So it has divided the world according to economic status. Now in Africa, we have a history of oppression through apartheid. For example, in South Africa. Now, when Evelyn, you asked me that question, what it means is that people need to understand that COVID-19 is causing tendencies of apartheid in Africa. Do you want to see your continent burning down? Would you want to see your continent burning down because of people who are having medical apartheid being imposed on the nationals? In Uganda, we have a nation which we are struggling to unite along tribal lines. Now, COVID-19 is providing a platform where the nation is being divided according to tribal lines. When you gave an example, for example, Honorable Winnie said some of the bars which are open belong to some people who are in power. Now, because and most of these people who are in power have the massive tribal sentiments around this. So do we want to unite the nation, or we want to divide the nation along COVID-19? So if you're going to oppress people along economic lines, if you're going to oppress people along tribal lines based on COVID, then do away with that discussion. Let us focus more on what unites us. What unites us more is not the vaccine mandates. No, they're dividing us more. What unites us more is not the closure of places of worship. Places of worship are the centers of unity in this nation. They are the fabric which forms our social aspect as a nation. That's what forms our national consciousness as a nation. So, yes, we have a legal duty, but that legal duty has to be put in the context of the prevailing political circumstances so that you know what is the best pursuit that you can take. And I think we are doing well for us to take the legal path of challenging whatever is illegal and is not moral for our nation.
All right. Thank you very much, Simon. In the same vein, I have a question for you, Honorable Winnie Kiza, and that will be our last for today. Somebody here says 99% of Ugandans are believers. What can politicians do to push for reopening of places of worship as a matter of urgency?
Oh, Winnie's off.
All right. I think we lost Honorable Winnie Kiza. I will move that question to Emily. Emily Barnes, I'll just repeat the question and maybe just change the context because it was pretty much focused on Uganda. The question here is, what can we do to push our politicians to push for the reopening of places of worship as a matter of urgency?
I think, okay, yeah. I think that what Simon has said is exactly right. I think putting pressure on the politicians, writing to them, demonstrating whatever works in your country, I think has got to be the thing. I was just, when Simon was speaking, I was curious to look down. I wanted to just look up what the vaccination rate in Uganda is, and it says it's 0.8%, which means a vaccine mandate is I mean, it's clearly exclusive. That's the 100% the express goal of it is to exclude people. And in that case, literally to less than 1% of the entire population, which, so when you flip around and then say, 99% of people are believers, it's an interesting, 99 plus 1 is 100. So then are they exactly opposite? Probably not. But I think that clearly these policies are unjust. They're clearly defined and decided for the top 1% in your case, without question. And they're clearly designed to exclude the bottom 99% of people from society, which again, that's, as Simon said, that is what government can possibly stand with that kind of policy. So as I think really continuing to push those leaders to acknowledge the injustice of that. I mean, how can you possibly even contemplate a policy? I mean, we're talking about excluding, say, 90 million people from society. That's what we're looking at. So like, about less than about a quarter of our less than a quarter of our population. You guys are talking about excluding 99% of your population from society. That is, it's, I mean, either way, like as Simon said, our rights are not given by government. They're inherent, and I think that is something that all of us seem to have forgotten, that it's not in front of mind nearly as much as it should be now. And I think we need to reassert those that let our politicians know that we do know that those rights are inherent and that are not given to us by them.
All right. Thank you very much, Emily. As we prepare to give our parting shots to Emily. All right, as we prepare to give our parting shots, Miss Honorable Winnie, are you back? Honorable Winnie, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, there's a question here for you. Emily answered it. Can you hear me well?
Yes. There was a question you had asked me.
Yes, there's a question I'd asked you. Emily had answered it, but we'll also give you an opportunity to respond to it specifically within the Ugandan context. What can we do to have our politicians push for reopening of places of worship? In 2 minutes, please.
I think the politicians have every mandate to do what is within their powers, representational, legislational, and other ways, to ensure that these unnecessary lockdowns are done away with, to ensure that the places of worship are open. Simon talked about their power under Article 3. But all citizens of Uganda have power under Article 1 that gives them all the power. Actually, Article 1 specifically says all power belongs to the people, who shall exercise their sovereignty under that same constitution that gives them the mandate to either decide on whatever they want to do. They have all the rights and freedoms under 30. Article 30, Article 29, Article 28, all these provisions are there, given to Ugandans to assemble, to go to school. Actually, Article 30 is the one that most violated under that, where they are saying our schools should remain closed. The government has dealt with the Article 30 to deny our children school education, because Article 30 says all Ugandans shall have a right to education. Article 29 gives them the latitude, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So all these have been broken by our own government, where the leaders vowed, took the oath of protecting and defending the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda. So all Ugandans are at liberty, either to even recall their leaders, to even say, government, enough is enough. Our God will be our God and will be worshipped at any cost. We must go and pray. Even when they say church leaders, pastors should participate in ensuring that the church goers or those who go to places of worship are vaccinated, for heaven's sake, they are not doctors. If the hospitals cannot have the right doctors to vaccinate citizens, if the vaccination centers are still 2 kilometers and 3-4 kilometers away from the citizens,
If the health workers are overwhelmed, are all the pastors going to be trained on how to vaccinate? So the issue of keeping people away from their God, from congregating and supporting each other spiritually, is the work of the devil, which we must resist at all costs. Secondly, keeping people away from one another is going to affect them psychologically and will affect them morally. So in a sense, after COVID, we are going to see high levels of mental health in Uganda and other countries that we have imposed these sanctions. First of all, you don't know how people are living and how they are surviving in their homes, but they are closed to themselves. Some other people find solace in going for prayers. When you pray for them, they feel better, they can still have energy to move the next day. The places of worship have been closed. When you say children should not congregate and hear from their church leaders or their religious leaders, then you are breeding another generation of Ugandans and Africans who have little regard for God, who have little regard for one another. So in the future, we are going to have a society that is exclusively isolated. That the children we are breeding will be children who only know mommy, daddy, sister, and brother. That is not African, and that is not human. So I really want to say, if the politicians are betraying their people, or if they also feel betrayed, let them call upon their population to say, guys, we only went there to represent you. As things have turned out, we are coming to tell you to do the work yourselves and demand that you represent yourselves. We have failed, and therefore take on the mantle and use Article 1 of the Constitution, which gives you all the power and authority to participate in the management of your affairs. Let us go and demand for accountability and demand for fair hearing, and therefore fully participating in the issues that concern them. You can't say people you are leading people by just passing to speak over them. Democracy in the stage is a situation where each voice will be heard. It's not about the voices of the majority or the will of the majority to be done, but that even the voices of the majority must be listened to. I actually look at politics not as a means of acquiring all the power that you have, but as a means to serve people. So as long as we still want to use politics as a vehicle to serve our people, those people must from time to time be consulted on how they feel they should be managed. And therefore, I still want to say that enough is enough with the lockdown. People need to be set free. We can only emphasize, do your best to make sure that you run away from trouble. I don't think there is anybody who would really want to kill themselves. Everybody would want to be safe and secure, so they can do whatever is within their means. When HIV came, they never introduced vaccine. They only told the people, please ensure you protect yourselves, and people are protecting themselves. Malaria, like I said from the word go, is even killing more people than COVID is doing. So I really want to thank you. I want to thank all those who have participated in this conversation. Emily, I want to thank you for sharing from your pot of wisdom. Simon, we want to thank you for spicing up the debate and making it very, very convenient. To all of you, our viewers and listeners, I want to say thank you so much for making it happen.
Thank you.
And thank you, Evelyn. Because it is my last, I have to sign off.
All right. You've given your parting shots as well. Thank you so much for your participation. It is quite valuable, and I'm sure we've taken keen notice of it. So I will invite Simon and Emily, respectively, to give their parting shots. Kindly keep it brief. We have just about 5 minutes to go.
All right, now I'll just conclude like this. Let me just make reference to what Emily said. Uganda is a predominantly religious country. 95% of the nation are believers. Now, an affront to the freedom of worship is an affront to the majority of the nationals of this state. The only equation to the affront of the freedom of worship can only be compared to what you've seen as the Holocaust in Germany, or the genocide in Rwanda, or the apartheid in South Africa. So one affront the freedom of worship is compared to only those heinous crimes internationally. I'll finalize with this other statement. There is right now the debate about how the politicians have handled the discussion of COVID-19 is a manifestation of political hypocrisy versus the fight of COVID-19. And I'll give you the hypocrisy. I just want to help Emily, who is not in Uganda, but also to remind the Ugandans who are the majority, who are watching right now, about some of the historical facts they need. Right now in Uganda, there is a looming debate about the scrapping of bail, where the president is saying, and you know, fundamentally pushing that, remove the right to bail or the right to the application for bail, as long as it is a treasonous offense. Let me make the Ugandans understand this. What if we wake up one day and our freedom of worship is deemed treasonous because we are opposing a globalist agenda? Would you remain silent? Now, the very president who is telling us this, I looked up something very quick, just to remind the Ugandans. On December 5th, 2018, the American court convicted a particular investor called Derek Ho Chi Ping over charges of bribing foreign leaders in Chad and in Uganda. Who are these leaders? Then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sam Kutesa, and guess who the second suspect was? His Excellency, the President of this nation. He was accused, and the court actually, this is the statement of court, so it's not a personal opinion. The American court said the President of Uganda received between 2014 and 2015, 1.8 billion, 500 million US dollars, that's about 1.8 billion Ugandan shillings. What that means in principle is that the president took a bribe, and the president should be the one who should be worried about if bail is scrapped, because he could be a chief suspect in this. And he wouldn't want to, you know, go down that path. But I'm trying to tie the political events of which are happening right now to what they could turn out to be a threat to our freedom of worship. So we saw the Prime Minister of Uganda yesterday at a place of worship in Kampala. The Archdiocese of Kampala was celebrating 55 years of existence at Rubaga Cathedral, and she said we should push for the scrapping of bail. And this debate comes up at the point where government is pushing for vaccine mandates, where the government is pushing for lockdown restrictions. Before we know it, the resistance lockdown restrictions could be deemed as treasonous, and because of that, you cannot be able to apply for bail. Now that means that wherever we are, we cannot remain silent. There is no religious leader who should remain silent at the point whereby we are pushing back this kind of discussion, because it is your right which is at stake. But I just want to thank Honorable Winnie. I want to thank Emily Burns for really joining us and for being a part of contributing to this discussion. As we seek to help many Ugandans and as we seek to help many Africans and people of the world to understand what really belongs to them, and also the church all over the world for realizing why they should remain firm at a time such as this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Over to you, Emily Burns, your parting shot. Emily?
Yes, thank you so much. I had to unmute myself. So I just want to say thank you all for inviting me, Simon. It has been, I have learned so much because again, I can't believe, to me, it is looking forward to what could be potentially a very frightening scenario for us. And I feel for you, because this is what you were experiencing is, it is truly tyrannical. From my perspective, and again, that it goes to show that this is, all of these policies, when they say slippery slope, that's exactly right. And you've said that 95% of the country are believers. I think that even the 5% who aren't need to look and realize that what's being done to churches is simply enough, it subsequently goes to unfavored businesses. And that's what we've seen everywhere. Is we need this multipolarity of our society. And I do think churches are very important as providing, we need a counterweight to government, right? The churches did that. I think that, in the past, like the academy used to do that, but now that's become part of government. In the past, the press used to do that, and we had so many different parts of civil society, and now they've become so subsumed all in the same, frankly, within government. And I do think that is it is a very, very worthwhile fight that you are fighting, that we are fighting here, to try and make sure we maintain our individual rights, because they are the only security that any democracy has against tyranny. And we are seeing this across the world in different levels and places that we never could have envisioned. And so again, thank you, Honorable Winnie. Thank you, Council Simon. Thank you, Evelyn, for inviting me. It's been truly enlightening. And inspiring to see your passion, Simon, but also inspiring because it's frightening. So thank you.
All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. COVID-19 and the political response. Our panelists have weighed in on the subject. You, our viewers, have weighed in on the subject. The call remains. Every voice counts. Stand up and speak. Speak until you have full reinstatement of your rights. These discussions, as a reminder, happen every Monday from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Kindly set your reminder for next Monday. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your comments, your questions. Not all of them have been read, but we've received all of them and we'll respond to them in due course. Have a productive week and God bless you.